Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got some seriously cutting-edge research to dig into today. You listeners sent this in fresh off the press. It's about how to study potentized preparations.
Yeah.
You know, the super diluted stuff used in homeopathy and other fields. They're calling them the PrePoP Guidelines, all about setting a high bar for research, and we're going deep on this.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is just how meticulous they are. Like, imagine worrying about whether your mood as a researcher could mess up an experiment. That's how precise they're trying to be.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We're talking about potentized preparations.
Yeah.
Which means taking a substance and diluting it again and again, sometimes to the point where statistically there's almost none of the original substance left. So how could there possibly be any effect? That's what these researchers are trying to figure out. And they start with a pretty unexpected challenge: the control substances themselves.
You'd think just plain water would be the obvious control, right? But these guidelines point out that even potentized water might not be totally neutral. There's research suggesting water from different sources could actually have different effects when potentized. Even after all that diluting, it makes you wonder, could the history of a substance, even after it's been diluted so many times, still have some kind of effect?
Wait, are we talking about water memory here?
Yeah.
That's wild. But how does this tie into the whole need for controls in experiments?
Well, it shows just how complex this research is and how important controls are to isolate the effect of whatever potentized substance you're testing. You need to compare it to a control that's as close to identical as possible except for that one substance. Even the act of shaking the liquid, what they call succussion, can cause physical and chemical changes.
Oh, so the control needs to go through all that same shaking and diluting too, just without the actual substance.
Exactly. It's like, trying to isolate a single instrument in an orchestra. You can't just listen to the whole thing and say, there's the flute. You got to silence the other instruments to really hear it.
Great analogy. So controls are like silencing those other instruments to make sure you're only measuring the effect of that potentized substance. But these guidelines take things even further, right? They get into this detective work of preventing bias.
Oh, absolutely. Bias is the enemy of good science. And a huge chunk of these guidelines is about how to prevent it. Like, they recommend blinding, which is basically like a taste test where you don't know what you're trying, so your expectations can't mess things up.
So the researcher wouldn't know which sample was the potentized substance and which was the control.
Exactly. They'd just be labeled with codes. And someone else would keep track of which was which. That way, the researcher analyzes the data without knowing, minimizing that bias.
Pretty smart. Keeps things objective. But isn't there a difference between studying the precise effects of a substance in the lab versus how it works in the real world? Like, if a farmer uses a potentized preparation and gets good results, do they care about the exact mechanism?
That's a really good point, and the guidelines actually do talk about that. Studying specific effects in a controlled lab setting is different from seeing if something works in a complex, real-world environment. Sometimes the outcome matters more than knowing exactly how or why it happened.
So, like, a farmer might care that their crops are doing well, even if the mechanism of the potentized preparation is still a mystery. It sounds like these guidelines are trying to bridge that gap. Rigorous science meets practical applications.
Exactly. Finding that sweet spot where good science can actually inform and enhance what people do in the real world. But they also acknowledge that real-world settings are messy and variable.
Okay, so they recognize that variability is a factor in these studies. Can you break down what they mean by variability and why it's so important to consider?
So variability basically means things in nature don't always act perfectly predictable, right? Like, think about planting seeds from the same packet. Some plants might grow taller, some might have more leaves, even though they have the same genes.
Right, just like even identical twins aren't totally identical. So how do these guidelines account for that natural variation?
They really emphasize using statistics. I know, it can be intimidating, but it helps us separate actual effects from just random chance. You want to be sure any difference you see between the treated group and the control group is meaningful, not just because of that natural variation.
So statistics help determine if the potentized substance is actually doing something measurable.
Yeah. More than just the normal ups and downs you'd expect. And the guidelines stress picking the right statistical test for the specific experiment you're running. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Sounds like they're building a fortress of scientific rigor here. And it feels like we're only scratching the surface of these guidelines. There's so much more to unpack, including some really out there stuff.
Oh, you're telling me. We haven't even touched on the most mind-boggling stuff like field effects and the idea that the experimenter's mood could actually influence the results. Buckle up because we're going down that rabbit hole next. These PrePoP guidelines, it's not just about doing a single study really well. They're trying to bring the whole field of potentized preparation research up a notch.
Yeah, you're right. It's like they're laying out a roadmap for the future, kind of anticipating all the challenges and setting these best practices, which is pretty cool for a field that's often seen as, controversial.
Totally. And one of the big things they emphasize is replication. You can't just do an experiment once and call it a day. Especially with these subtle effects, you got to repeat things multiple times, ideally under different conditions too, to see if those results hold up.
So it's like you're testing how robust a theory is, making sure it's not just some fluke, kind of like running a software program a bunch of times to make sure it doesn't have glitches.
Exactly. Replication helps build confidence, weed out any weird results, and these guidelines even suggest going a step further, like exploring different facets of a phenomenon. Say you've shown that a certain potentized substance has a consistent effect on plant growth rate. The next step might be to try and figure out the mechanism of that effect.
Okay, so how would you go about doing that? It seems like a tough task given how subtle these preparations are.
Well, one way is to play around with the potency, see if changing that changes the effect. Like, test a 1x potency, then a 10x, 100x, and see if there's a dose-response relationship there.
That makes sense. If a higher potency has a stronger effect, it could give you clues about how it's interacting with the plant.
Right, helps us understand those dynamics. And another approach is looking at different endpoints, as they call them. So instead of just plant height, maybe also look at leaf size, root development, even gene expression.
So it's about getting this broader picture of how the potentized substance is affecting the plant, not just one isolated thing.
Exactly. And that brings up another interesting point, the idea of synergy. Could there be other factors at play that influence how these preparations work, like specific nutrients in the soil or something?
Ah, so it's not just the substance on its own, but how it interacts with the whole system, the plant, the soil, the environment. Sounds like an incredibly complicated puzzle.
It really is. And these guidelines acknowledge that complexity. They're encouraging researchers to think about that whole system, not just isolated bits and pieces.
It strikes me that this research is kind of inherently interdisciplinary. It's not just chemistry or biology or physics. It's got to be all those things and more.
Oh, absolutely. You've got chemists studying water, physicists looking at electromagnetic fields, biologists studying living organisms, even mathematicians developing models to try and explain what's going on.
It's like a melting pot of science, all focused on this one crazy frontier. But with all this talk about meticulous methods and controls and stuff, we still haven't gotten to the big question. How do these super diluted substances actually work?
Haha. Yeah, the million-dollar question. And honestly, we don't have a definitive answer yet. But there are some pretty interesting theories out there, and these guidelines encourage people to investigate them further.
Well, spill the beans. What are some of the leading explanations for how something so diluted could still have an effect?
One of the most popular ones is the idea of water memory. The idea is that the process of making these preparations somehow imprints information from the original substance onto the water molecules, or the alcohol molecules, if that's what you're using.
Okay, I've heard of this, but it sounds almost mystical. Is there any real scientific evidence to support this water memory concept?
It's still a very active area of research, but there is some evidence that's pretty suggestive. Like some studies show that these potentized preparations can actually change the structure of water molecules, even at those super high dilutions.
So like the water molecules are arranging themselves differently based on the information they got from the potentized substance. Wow. But then how does that information get to a living organism? That's another puzzle, right?
Yeah, that's another big piece researchers are working on. One possibility is that it involves some kind of subtle energy transfer, maybe through electromagnetic fields.
Electromagnetic fields, like the stuff around magnets and electricity, don't those usually act over pretty short distances?
Right, but we're not talking about your typical electromagnetic fields here. There's more and more research suggesting that living things emit and are influenced by these super subtle energy fields, and maybe potentized preparations are tapping into those somehow.
Okay, now we're getting into mind-bending territory. So you're saying the information that got imprinted on the water molecules can be carried by these subtle energy fields and then interact with the energy fields of a living thing.
That's one of the main hypotheses, and it could totally change how we understand living systems, but we're really just starting to explore this.
This is starting to sound like science fiction, but these PrePoP guidelines are encouraging researchers to go for it.
Totally. They're saying, let's investigate these unconventional ideas, but let's do it rigorously. And let's also be mindful of the ethical questions that come with this kind of exploration.
Ethical considerations. What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. What if we discover that our intentions can actually directly influence experiments? That would change everything about how we do science. We'd need to be way more self-aware and responsible as researchers. How do you control for something as subjective as a researcher's mood? That's the kind of ethical dilemma these guidelines are raising.
A lot to take in. Water memory, energy fields, the experimenter's influence. It's all connected somehow, but we're just beginning to understand it.
Exactly. We're in uncharted territory here, and these PrePoP guidelines are like our compass. They're pushing us to ask big questions and develop really solid methods to investigate these wild phenomena.
This deep dive has been amazing. We'll put links to the PrePoP guidelines and some other resources in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn more. This is a field that's just ripe for discovery. Who knows what we'll find out next?
I think we're seeing a major shift happening in how scientists are thinking. These guidelines are setting the stage for a future where we might understand how everything is connected in a whole new way. It's a really exciting time to be following this research.
Totally agree. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of potentized preparations and the PrePoP guidelines. Keep those questions coming, and we'll dive into more fascinating topics next time. Okay, so we're back and ready to get into the really weird stuff. The stuff that makes you wonder if we've wandered into some kind of, science fiction movie. We talk about water memory, energy fields. Now it's time to face those field effects and the idea that a researcher's mood could actually, influence an experiment.
Yeah, this is the stuff that even some scientists are like, whoa, hold on a minute. But these PrePoP guidelines are basically saying, look, if these things are real, we got to investigate them.
It's a bold move for sure.
Right.
So remind me again about these field effects. We're talking about just being near a potentized substance could change the properties of another substance. Is that right?
That's what some of the research suggests, yeah. Imagine this. You have two samples of water, identical, right? One's been potentized, one hasn't. You keep them separate but close together. And after a while, the untreated water starts showing some of the same characteristics as the potentized water.
Seriously? Like some kind of invisible connection. How is that even possible? It's not magnetism, it's not gravity, right?
Right. It's something else entirely. And some researchers think it might tie back to those subtle energy fields we were talking about earlier. What if the information that got imprinted on the water molecules during potentization is actually radiating outward, creating a kind of field of influence?
So like ripples in a pond spreading out from that potentized substance. And those ripples can bump into other things and change them.
Yeah, that's a good way to visualize it. Like those
Yeah.
ripples of information are interacting with the subtle energy fields of other substances and causing them to shift.
It's wild.
Yeah.
But is there even a way to test this scientifically? These effects seem so incredibly subtle.
It's a huge challenge for sure. The effects are so tiny we need totally new instruments and techniques to even detect them. It's like trying to study the stars without a telescope. You can see some, but you're missing the whole picture.
So we need a whole new set of scientific tools to even start understanding this. And then on top of that, you have the whole experimenter's mood thing. Is this where science meets, like the paranormal or something?
Haha, it might feel that way, but there are some interesting stories out there. Researchers have noticed that sometimes their experiments with potentized preparations seem to work better when they're in a positive mood. And when they're stressed or distracted, the results are less consistent.
You mean like the experimenter's thoughts and feelings could be affecting the experiment?
That's the idea. It goes back to that concept that our thoughts and emotions might actually create an energetic field around us. So if an experimenter is feeling really positive, maybe that positive energy is somehow influencing the potentized preparation and vice versa.
I mean, we talk about the mind-body connection, but this takes it to a whole other level. If our thoughts and emotions can affect our own bodies, is it so crazy to think they could affect things outside of us?
It really highlights how interconnected everything might be. Maybe these subtle energy fields are the bridge between us and the world around us. And that's where those ethical considerations come back in.
Right, you were saying that exploring these subtle realms raises some big ethical questions.
Imagine if we find out that our intentions can directly influence experiments. That would revolutionize how we do science. Researchers would need to be so much more self-aware and responsible. How do you even control for something like a researcher's mood? It's a tough question.
It's mind-boggling for sure. Water memory, energy fields, experimenter influence, it's all connected somehow, but we're just starting to figure it out.
Absolutely. We're in uncharted territory, and these PrePoP guidelines are like our map. They're helping us ask the right questions and develop really rigorous methods to explore all of this.
Well, this deep dive has been a wild ride. If you're listening and want to explore more, We'll have links to the PrePoP Guidelines and other resources in the show notes. This field is full of potential discoveries. It's exciting to think about what we might find out next.
I think we're witnessing a major shift in how we understand the world. These guidelines are setting the stage for a future where we might see those connections in a whole new way.
I totally agree. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of potentized preparations and the PrePoP Guidelines. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of our universe.